Good evening. We're on the air again with another edition of Pachios on the News. And we have a very interesting guest tonight. You know that I get guests that I'm curious about, that I want to know what makes them tick. I want to know why they think what they think. And they come from the right, the left, and very occasionally from the middle, like that's where I am. So I like the people that I'm not quite in sync with because they're interesting. And we have a very interesting guest tonight, Lisa Savage. Some of you may remember that in 2020, in the U.S. Senate campaign, Lisa Savage ran, not as a Democrat, not as a Republican. We had Susan Collins and who was the Democrat?
Sarah Gideon.
Sarah Gideon. But Lisa was, under what banner did you run?
Well,
Green?
I tried to run as a Green. I was a Green. I was registered Green. And the rules in Maine are so unfair to third parties, any third party, not just the Green Party, that I could not get on the ballot as a Green. So I unenrolled, and as an independent, we gathered enough signatures in one day, Super Tuesday, to get on the ballot.
So anyway, I really have not met Lisa in person until tonight, I think.
I think so.
And but I remember watching her on a debate in 2020, and I said, this is my view. I'm not going to vote for her. She's too far to the left for me, but she's the smartest. She's a terrific candidate, articulate and very smart, and so I was impressed.
Thank you.
And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you 4 years later on this show. So you live in Solon, Maine.
I do.
And you graduated of Bowdoin College.
That's right.
What class?
77.
The class of 77 at Bowdoin. And you describe yourself as a teacher.
Was a teacher for 25 years in the public schools up in central Maine. Yep.
A union negotiator.
I was a union negotiator for teachers, for like the local of the teachers union.
An author.
I have a couple of books, yes.
And an organizer.
That's true, all true.
I love that term, organizer. That's what Barack Obama was, an organizer.
So he claims. I've never seen any receipts to prove that Barack Obama was an organizer, but yes, that is on his resume.
Yeah, you'll get the picture now that it's clear Lisa is, she's from the left. She is not a fan of the Republicans or Donald Trump, and she's really not a fan of the Democrats either.
Really not.
True?
True.
True. So you're getting some independent views here. Let me just, to set the stage, ask you a question that I was going to ask at the end of the show.
Okay.
Are you voting for Donald Trump?
No.
You're not going to vote for Trump?
Well, we have ranked choice voting, so I'm going to rank Jill Stein first.
Okay.
I probably won't rank Trump or Harris at all.
Okay.
I don't want either one of them.
So I was going to be dramatic and say, are you voting for Donald Trump? And she'd say no, and I was going to say, and are you voting for Kamala Harris? And she'd say no. And I thought that would kind of set the stage for this. So you're a believer, obviously, in ranked choice voting, and you thought that ranked choice voting would be very helpful to you in the Senate campaign in 2020, but Susan Collins got over 50% of the vote, so that was the end of that.
That she did. She hit 51%, and that was the trigger to not go into the next round. It was disappointing to me. It's not that I thought I'd win. I just wanted to be in the debates. That's why I did that.
Yeah.
And honestly, if it hadn't been a ranked choice voting election, I wouldn't have done it because I didn't want to be a spoiler and get Susan Collins again. But in ranked choice voting, there is no spoiler by definition. So, but I would have loved it if we'd gone to the second round, because I think probably a lot of people who voted for the Democrat would have ranked me second. It would have been interesting to find out.
I don't want to sound like a wise guy when I ask some questions, but this is the way I ask questions sometimes. So, what made you a well-known organizer, lefty organizer? What was it? One thing, or was it just an accumulation of things? Yeah, I asked you that previously, and you said you liked history.
Yeah, I was always I was always reading history books and historical fiction as a kid.
So what was it about history that drove you into this left lane?
I think my parents were an influence. My mother grew up very poor. My father was from the petty bourgeoisie of the central Maine, but he became pretty lefty out in California, where I grew up, and he would come home and say things like, "Well, I think garbage collectors should get paid as much as doctors. They contribute to our health at least as much." And, he was very egalitarian.
Okay.
I think his father, my grandfather, who was a state senator in Maine, Brooks Savage, was very egalitarian. Although I never got to meet him, I think that carried through my father. And, so, left-leaning people feel that it's not right to have people driving around in fabulously expensive cars, owning 5 houses, while other people can't feed their children. That's morally wrong, and it's unstable. It's not a recipe for a good, stable
that happens
society.
in a capitalist society.
Indeed, it does.
I mean, there's no way around it.
That's right.
Because people have equal rights, but some are smarter than others. Some are tougher than others. Some are taller than others.
Well, people are born on third base and think they hit a triple. If you're born with a silver spoon in your mouth, you don't have to work very hard to be wealthy and own a bunch of stuff.
As was said about George H.W. Bush by Ann Richards. But, so you don't think that people should have inherited money?
Well, I inherited money.
But
a little property, a little money.
You think that's wrong. That tilts the scales.
I don't think there should be so much disparity between the haves and the have-nots.
Okay.
In my childhood, having been born in 1956, the discrepancies in wealth in this country were not as great. They have been galloping apart for, basically our whole lifetime.
In the 1920s, like history, they were great in the 1920s, and then we had the Depression.
That's right.
And we had Roosevelt's New Deal, and then World War II, and then we had the GI Bill, which really began to equalize things.
Not for black people. Did you know that black GIs didn't get the GI Bill?
Yeah, I'm not getting into the right now. We'll talk about it later.
Okay.
The color of people. I'm talking about people. There were people. They're white people. Okay, they were white people. There was discrimination. We can get into a 7-hour discussion here.
Well, we were talking economics, and you were, I think, making the point that the GI Bill was a great equalizer. It brought a lot of people up into the middle class that hadn't been there before.
Do you disagree with that?
I don't disagree with it, but only maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I found out black GIs didn't get the GI Bill benefits.
Okay.
They didn't get help with their mortgages, and they didn't get help with their college educations. That is inherently unfair, don't you think?
So the gap now between the rich and the poor is similar to what it was after World War I.
It's true.
Same type
We're
of
in
thing.
another gilded age.
Another gilded age.
Yep.
See, we don't agree on some things, but we agree on that. We are in another gilded age. No question about that. Back to you, so we were talking about your mother was a Democrat. She was poor. You told me that she was part of the Great Migration from the Dust Bowl to California. Her family was.
My mother wasn't a Democrat till the end of her life. My parents were both Republicans. When I was in high school arguing with them about the Vietnam War, they voted for Richard Nixon twice with me going, "What are you doing?" And they said, "Well, Democrat Party is the racist party, so we can't be Democrats."
So they put it, their views were framed through this racist prism. That
Well, at least their party affiliation was.
their party affiliation. Of course, your father was the son of a very prominent Maine Republican state senator, right?
Yes,
Your grandfather.
That's true.
I think I did a little research. I think he was the majority leader of the Maine Senate at one time. But I think today, if you look around, you don't think that just because people are poor or they're deprived, that they sit around and say, I'm not going to vote for the Republicans because they like the status quo, and I'm out of a job up in Lincoln, Maine. I don't have the mill job anymore. I'm poor and I'm angry. And those rich people, those rich Republicans who worry about taxes and so forth, I don't have anything in common with them, and I can't be in the same party with them. And that they're all for Donald Trump. The rich people are for Donald Trump, and the people in Lincoln are for Donald Trump.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
Well, what I make of it is, who's the American president that sent all those manufacturing jobs out of Maine and completely gutted the, working class industrial economy of Maine? What president was in the White House when that happened? Bill Clinton. NAFTA destroyed the mills and the economy.
So you say free trade drove them into the arms of the rich Republicans.
I wouldn't call it free trade. That's a term that rich capitalists put on, so it makes it sound better, free trade.
Well, it's a term I use, and I'm only a semi-rich capitalist.
Okay. I don't think that was really free trade. I think that was, again, very wealthy people saying, hey, why are we putting up, Maine has a very high rate of unemployment, or not unemployment, but workers' compensation, because so many jobs in Maine are dangerous and people get hurt. And I think a lot of business people in the country said, why are we paying union wages? We have to deal with negotiating with the union. We have to pay all this workers' comp, unemployment premiums. Why don't we just get this stuff made in a country where they don't have any of those laws or protections for workers? We'd make a lot more money if we did that, wouldn't we?
Don't you think industry from all over the country went abroad? I mean,
yes, indeed.
Yeah, it wasn't just Maine.
No. But
there were a lot of reasons.
Maine didn't have a lot of resilience economically. Places like California, there's a lot of good things going on, a lot of economic sectors. But, I live in central Maine. People are pretty darn poor in central Maine. A lot of hardworking people.
And they love Donald Trump, right?
A lot of them do, yes.
Why do they love Donald Trump?
Because he owns the libs, I believe.
In other words,
basically, he basically has a persona of like a championship wrestling, professional wrestling guy. He's a showman. He knows how to play that role. He says all the things that like they got in trouble for saying in high school, and he gets away with it. And they overlook the fact that he's really wealthy.
What about the racist
claims
things
to be
he
really
says?
Wealthy. They overlook that too, because Maine's really racist, super racist. If you ever wade into teaching about the indigenous people of Maine, and you start paying attention to maybe the comments in the newspaper or the kind of things people, I taught high school for a long time, and high school students reflected. They didn't agree with the racism of their families often, but they lived it, they reflected it, and they brought it into the classroom, and we discussed it.
And they were young kids in Maine from an insular state.
Yep.
And insular families.
Yep. And if their parents were ambitious and wanted to make more money, they had already done what my father did after he graduated from college. His second try, he went out of Bowdoin on the C roll because all he did was play football and drink beer for 2 years. His father, who was very ill from World War I injuries, died. And my father left Bowdoin and went in the Army. Met my mother. When he came back out, he had no transferable credits from his 2 years at Bowdoin. Good job, Dad. So he went to Orono, and I was born, and my 3 younger siblings were born while he was a student. Well, maybe my youngest sister. He had graduated by then. And then we moved. He worked for a little bit for what was then called the Merrill Trust Company in Bangor, and then we moved to California because there was a lot more economic activity there, and he got a job doing pretty much the same thing he was doing, but making lots more money. And I think, you know, many people left Maine over the years for economic reasons. And the people that didn't leave Maine for economic reasons have, in many cases, had a hard time of it.
So, when you ran for the Senate, you were for Medicare for all.
I was.
What's the difference, and if I want you to explain it to the folks here, the difference between Medicare for all and the public option? The public option is you can get government insurance. It's available, but it's competitive. In other words, private insurers can compete with it. It is not exclusive. It is Medicare for all means there is no private insurance. It's only government.
So you just explained it, so you didn't need me to.
Okay.
I was in favor of Medicare for all. It isn't the best universal health care, but it was a program that was already working for many Americans, and it was already set up. All doctors and hospitals, they already had their Medicare numbers. So it was a program that you could have just opened it up and said, okay, now we're enrolling all these people that need health care right now, you know, needed it yesterday, and now we can get it started. I don't think it's the ideal form of universal health care. I've lived in Japan for 4 years. They had the most amazing universal health care system. It cost me like $2.50 to take my baby to the doctor when he was sick, and they gave him the amoxicillin right there and said, come back. We're only going to give you 2 days worth because we want you to come back in a couple days so we can make sure the baby's all right. You know, they had public transportation. You just stepped out of your house. There was a bus went to the train went to the, you know, bullet train. These things are all possible. It's the military budget of this country that has impoverished us, and we don't have the nice things that we could afford to have because Pentagon contractors get it all.
When you ran for Congress, were you in favor of what they call, I don't even know what it is, defund the police?
Yes.
What does it mean?
Defund the police, it means cut their budget. And people used to squawk, how are the police supposed to do their job? And as a teacher, I was like, well, I've had my budget cut many times and I still showed up and did my job.
But how much should the budget be cut?
How much of the policing budget should be cut?
Just you say, okay, across the board, 20%? Or should it be thoughtful?
It should be thoughtful, and I'm not a specialist in funding or defunding the police. The police are basically, you know, evolved from being slave patrollers. They exist to keep. This is one of the things my father said when I was a teenager. You know, the police just exist to keep the poor from eating the rich. That is their job. That is why they exist.
So, I was going to ask you that you later on in the program, but you think much about human nature? You ever
Sure. Really, I wanted to be a Well, I went into college thinking I'd be a psychology major, but in those days it was the Skinnerian psychology, where you were training a rat in a box to press a lever to get a food pellet. That didn't interest me very much, so I drifted to history, because history is kind of like looking at human psychology and how it played out, you know, before you came along. So yes, I think a lot about human nature. I've lived abroad. I've met people from lots of different places.
Okay, so you've had a lot of experience. You've done a lot of reading. Have you reached any conclusions about human nature? What is your understanding about human nature? Let's to be a catalyst here. Are there good people, bad people?
No, I think that all people have intrinsically value as, you know, souls. They are a person. Every person is equal to every other person, in the sense that we're alive here on Earth, and there's nothing. I'm not going to say those people are bad, those people are good. Now, do people do bad things under the influence of, you know, violent ideologies or fear mongering, or if your children were literally starving, you and I would probably do some pretty bad things, what other people would consider some bad things, because you can't, it's hard to watch your child suffer like that and not steal to feed them or whatever.
You've seen all the people that can't feed their children well enough, they do bad things?
No. I'm saying
I
if
think
my
they don't
children
do
were
bad things.
if my children were starving, I might do some things that would be considered bad things. But
You
you know,
would?
psychological research shows if you put people in a position in an authoritarian type structure, remember the Millman experiments, where they
I don't.
These were really famous experiments at Harvard where they put a person in a room and they said, okay, you're going to administer an electric shock. And we're going to crank it up. Okay, do more, do it more. And practically every single person in the experiment was willing to keep shocking. Now, it was all faked. And the person that was supposedly receiving the shock was faking it when they'd go, ah! But the person, because there was someone in a white lab coat saying, you have to do it again. The experiment must go on. You have to do it again. And basically, no one stood up and said, I'm not doing this. This is wrong. I'm out of here.
So, what about people that are mentally ill and do terrible things, like in Connecticut, shoot 23 children to death?
What are you asking me? Is there mental illness? Yes, there are people with mental illness.
And what do you do about that?
Well, they should be receiving proper medical
treatment. What if they don't want proper medical care?
Well, then if they've harmed other people, you're going to have to force them to be, many people are incarcerated in psychiatric institutions.
But that takes police to arrest them, to investigate crimes and to arrest them.
Well, not necessarily. You can do this in a way other than having heavily armed police. When I lived in Japan,
heavily armed police.
I lived in Japan, the police did not have guns. They had no weapons.
I know, but you just changed the subject.
Oh, okay, sorry.
You just used the term heavily armed. That wasn't my question.
Okay.
We're talking about defunding the police, and we're talking about your view that people are intrinsically good, so you really don't need
I didn't say they were intrinsically good. I said they are intrinsically valuable. Every person, in my view, and this is more of a spiritual viewpoint, really, has the same intrinsic value as any other person.
Okay, so you concede it's not a practical view of life, it's spiritual.
Well, we're living in a super violent, repressive society. You and I have lived in it our entire lives. Do you think this is all that's possible, really? This is the best humans can do?
You think it's a super repressive society?
Very repressive society.
Well,
what's the country on earth with the most people in prison?
With the most people in prison? Well, you'd have to look at the populations. Probably the big population.
All right,
countries.
highest rate of incarceration.
You're going to say the United States?
It is, by a mile.
So you
Nobody else even comes close.
So far more than in Russia, right?
Far more.
Okay, so that means that the United States is a far more repressive society than Russia?
I think so.
I've
never been to Russia, but I know people that.
Well, I've been there many times.
I know people that have moved from Maine to Russia that I'm still friends with and I'm in touch with that say, "Wow, it's pretty nice here." Why is Edward Snowden living in Moscow? Why is Tara Reid living in Moscow?
Well, look.
Do you know who I mean by Tara Reid?
No, I don't.
She's the woman that accused Joe Biden of sexually assaulting her when she was a staffer.
Yeah, you want to get into that?
I'm just saying, a lot of people deliberately moved to Russia in the last, 20 years, and they don't think it's as repressive as
That's not true. A lot of people have deliberately left Russia in the last few years. Many more than have moved to Russia.
I don't know what the numbers are.
We can demonstrate that. So. Most people think it's a repressive society. You don't.
Most people are pretty confused about pretty much everything right now. Most people do not have any sources of good information.
Well, so you're saying most people are confused. You're not confused.
Well, I don't understand everything perfectly. Who does? But I have much better sources of information than most Americans, certainly of my generation, do. Definitely much better.
That's interesting. You mean people that you have sources that give you the right information?
I mean that I read widely. I use the internet a lot to gather information. I read publications from all over the world, and I don't just watch some corporate news program and say, okay, now I'm informed. And I think most baby boomers are pretty much there at that. Okay, one watches CNN and one watches Fox News. I think they're both equally misinformed, my opinion.
Do you think that there are other people who read a lot and do research on the internet that reach different conclusions than you do?
I'm sure they do.
So, defund the police. We don't know how much to defund them, right?
I'd defund them all the way, personally.
Eliminate police.
Reinvest the money in supporting the communities where people are committing crime out of poverty. So, invest in true mental health care, which we do not have in this country and have not had. You know, I'm sure that there are people that could be trained to intervene in violent, frightening, scary situations where people are mentally ill. And America, the police just, your family calls and goes, my family member's freaking out, please come and help. We can't control him, he's going to hurt himself or somebody else. And the police walk in and shoot the person within a couple minutes.
All the time?
All the time, no, but often, quite often. You know what I think is funny?
What?
When I ran, I was in 4 debates and they kept me out of the 5th debate. And I continuously heard from people, and since have heard, similar to what you said, wow, you were so good in the debates. You really seemed like knowledgeable and you were able to express yourself. But what I think is interesting is since that time, people completely disagree with me, think I'm completely wrong on policing, completely wrong on Israel, completely wrong on Ukraine. Like, what happened in those 4 years? Did I really become so misinformed since 2020?
Well, what I said about you is that you're smart, you're articulate, and you were very good on the debate. I didn't agree with you. Mm-hmm. I have a different view, which does not mean that I'm not smart, I'm not articulate, and not well informed. People have different views, and the reason I have you on this program tonight is because I think you're smart and well informed, and you have views that I find it difficult to agree with. On the other hand, you have some views I do agree with. Mm-hmm. For instance, you believe that for people who are serious about higher education, that their higher education should be free, that it shouldn't be just K through 12, it should be K through 16.
Like in Russia.
Yeah. If you I spent some time in Russia, and mm-hmm. I spent some time there during the communist period, 2 trips. Mm-hmm. I'm going to tell the folks about one of them. Theodore Sorensen was John Kennedy's chief of staff, top assistant. After Kennedy's death, Sorensen was asked by the Russians to come and speak at this Russian think tank on America called the Institute for U.S. and Canadian Studies in Moscow. And he put it off until he was running for the U.S. Senate. And then he wanted to go, and he called me up and he said, will you go with me? Because I'm running for the Senate. So we spent 8 or 9 days in Moscow. It was horrible. It was, drab. There wasn't a neon light in the whole city because the government owned everything. There was no competition. Nobody was trying to get customers.
What year was this?
This was 1970. 1970. Mm-hmm. I went back in 1978 for 3 weeks in Russia and the Ukraine. And it was a little bit better, but it was pretty bad. And so those who think they'd like to live in a society that the Russians live in, different now, because they're capitalists. They've got all kinds of corrupt people there, stealing from the...
Gosh, even the Chinese are capitalists now.
Yeah, stealing from the public. But it does, I must say, it takes me back, shocks me when people say that the United States is a more repressive society than Russia. That I can't. But anyway, that's a form of argument. I'm not here to argue with you. So I agree with what you said about college being free. The trick is to make sure that those who are just on a lark and don't care, you got to kind of distinguish them out of the program. For universal child care, what is universal? I know how important child care is. What is universal? Is that a kind of a key word, the universal part?
Well, meaning that anyone who needs access to child care so they can work can get access to dependable, affordable, safe child care.
Yeah.
You know, when I was running, you know what the #1 issue was that people brought up with me? Child care.
That doesn't surprise me. I happen to agree with you. So we're in the same space there. Get money out of politics. I agreed with you there. Ending wars. I think 99% of the people in this world don't like wars.
I think you're right.
They don't want their children killed.
Nope.
They don't want their homes blown up.
Of course.
They don't like war. So we agree with you. End wars. Now, back to human nature. In the context of what you understand about human nature, how do we achieve the goal of ending wars?
Well, you know, when you started to ask me about defunding the police, I thought you were going to ask me about defunding the Pentagon.
We'll get there.
You know, the Pentagon gobbles up more than half of the discretionary budget. In other words, the money Congress can spend each year. Some parts of the budget are already spoken for, and that they're not. You know, every year the share of the pie gets bigger and bigger for the Pentagon, so that some CEO of General Dynamics can make $22 million a year and get a new yacht.
Well, there may be other reasons why the Pentagon budget gets bigger,
I think
other than the guy from General Dynamics.
It's a woman who's the CEO of General Dynamics, but that is the primary reason that the Pentagon budget is as sky high as it is.
So you say.
I've been studying this for years. I'm pretty sure I'm right about this.
We give you that. You study all the time. You read all the time. We give you that. But I'd say
particularly the Pentagon budget has interested me for the last.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah. But there's probably a lot of people in this country that know something about the Pentagon budget. First of all, it gets funded by Congress, so congressional staffs have to know something about it. I understand you think it's too big. You think it should be eliminated?
I think it could be cut down to a true self-defense force, such as other countries have.
What's a true self-defense force?
In other words, you maintain enough of a military to defend yourself. We have 800 military bases outside the U.S. That's not self-defense. That's an empire. And it's really expensive and unsustainable.
It's not self-defense. Why are they there? So we can occupy those countries?
Yes. So we can control their resources. We can
you say that all the
put in a puppet
bases,
government. We can extract their lithium or
we have more military
oil
bases. We have more military bases in Germany than in any other country of the world. A large percentage of our military bases abroad are in Germany. Is that so we can occupy and take over Germany?
Well, we've done a pretty good job since the Ukraine, the coup of the Ukrainian government, elected government in 2014. Then Germany now, since we bombed the Nord Stream pipeline, Germany, I just saw yesterday.
Who bombed the Nord Stream pipeline?
The United States and Norway together bombed the Nord Stream pipeline.
Where'd you get that? Show us the source.
Seymour Hersh.
Huh?
Seymour Hersh.
Seymour Hersh.
Good old Seymour Hersh. Remember the My Lai massacre?
Listen, I know all about Seymour Hersh. Okay. I've met Simon several times. I worked in Washington in the 60s. Cy Hersh I know. Not well. He doesn't know me. But he says that. He's said a lot of things that aren't true. He said a lot of things that aren't true. So you say people rely on sources that aren't reliable. You do too.
Well, he's not the only source that thinks that the U.S. and Norway bombed the Nord Stream pipeline.
Well,
when they first did it, they blamed it on Russia. Why would Russia blow up their own pipeline that they had just finished building to Germany? They could have just turned off the supply on their end.
We don't want to take up too much time doing this, but what I do this from time to time. I say to the people at home, go online and look up the Nord Stream pipeline, and particularly stuff in the last 2 weeks about the arrest of the Ukrainian who blew it up. Just do your own research. Don't rely on me. Don't rely on Lisa. Do your own research.
I don't believe Ukraine had the resources to do that kind of an operation that deep in the sea. Ukraine was a pretty poor country, not with a great military, not with a lot of technological expertise. I don't think Ukraine could have possibly blown up the Nord Stream pipeline.
Lisa.
I mean, you can agree with me or disagree with me.
No, we'd be no reason to agree with, because there are facts other than what you put forward as facts. So take your pick. That's what I'm telling the people. You don't necessarily have to believe Lisa.
No, you don't.
Look at other sources and then make up your own mind.
Because a conversation that we're going to have for an hour is not going to be able to reveal what information has led you to.
Correct.
So forth. I would suggest people might want to read my blog, because when I write about something like the Nord Stream pipeline, I link to the information that I've found, that I've read, that I believe is worth considering, and there'll be a link in it. And you can click and you can go through and you can read an article from, wherever, or watch a video from someplace.
One of the things that gets people a little bit upset about Donald Trump is he doesn't make mistakes. He claims that he knows everything and he doesn't make mistakes. And so people, react against it, and some love it. And some love it when they deal with a person who absolutely knows the answers, no doubt, has no doubts.
Are you saying that's me?
No, I'm just saying, using Trump as an example. No, I don't think you have many doubts.
I've changed my mind so many times. I'm constantly changing my mind. I supported Obama at first. I was fooled by Obama just like most people were. He said all the right things. He did it so articulately, and he was intelligent finally, and we had all been embarrassed with W being such a doomkopf and embarrassing us on the, but I got fooled. Actually, again, if you were to read, I've been blogging for, decades now. If you were to go back to the beginning and start from there and read through, you would realize, wow, she's changed her mind quite a lot.
Okay, yeah. I accept that.
Yeah.
So let's go back to human nature and wars. Would you agree with the fact that the current war in Ukraine, not
the one that started in February of 22?
Yeah.
Okay.
Resulted from the Russians massing a large army on the Ukrainian border and simply moving into Ukraine.
Why did they do that? What was their motivation to do that?
I said, would you agree that's why it started?
No.
No. Oh, okay.
Started in 2014 when there was a color revolution, coup in the Maidan, right? One of those color revolutions, and then Ukraine began consistently shelling the Donbass, their own territories,
their own territory.
Their border,
because there was an insurrection there. I mean, there was not for no reason. There was an insurrection.
Do you agree that there was a coup in 2014 that overthrew their democratically elected government?
I agree there was a coup in 2014. Mm-hmm. Yes, I do.
So that's really when the current war the current Ukraine war
You think
started.
you think you think the Russians do not want to occupy the Ukraine? You think there's not a territorial war? You think that they're not interested in acquiring Ukrainian territory?
No, I think that they tried to negotiate the Minsk agreements to forestall having to go in and do a special military operation. And the UK and the US made sure that the Minsk agreements were just a stalling technique. Nobody, they've all admitted we never intended to keep our side of the bargain. And,
There is Angela Merkel, the German leader, did say that it was a stalling technique, but neither party observed either Minsk I or Minsk II. Neither side, the Russians or the Ukrainians. They didn't trust each other. Neither side stopped battling it out in the Donbass.
Remember when NATO said they weren't going to move 1 inch to the east? How many inches to the east has NATO moved since that false promise was made?
If they could move further to the east, they would, because
they keep on,
in Eastern Europe,
on.
There is a fear of the Russians. It's well-founded. You like history.
The Russians are who beat the Nazis in World War II. The U.S. tries to say it was the U.S. It was not the U.S. It was the Red Army that beat the Nazis in Europe.
I know a lot about World War II. Wait a minute. Say that again. The U.S. didn't have anything to do with beating the Nazis?
I didn't say they didn't have anything to do with it, but the U.S. takes a lot of credit and has spent decades.
Who's the U.S. taking credit? Who? Somebody in the U.S. is saying we need to take credit?
Yeah.
Who is that person?
Many people. You could watch the History Channel and every show would be about how we beat Hitler. Well, really, the Red Army beat Hitler.
I would say...
And the U.S. had a lot going on over in the Pacific by then.
Wait a minute.
And they, yes.
Wait a minute. And, that's enough. Don't you think they both had a big role, both the Russians and the United States, in beating the Germans?
No, I do not think that the U.S. had as big a role, not even comparable to Russia. No, I don't.
Now that, I have to say, that's just totally wrong. That is not a historical fact. The Red Army had a huge role in it, and so did the United States and England. Now, a lot of people, Americans, got killed in that war in Europe. Not just in the Pacific,
I know that.
in Europe.
Compared to how many Russians died?
Well, a lot of the Russians died because the deaths occur on Russian territory because they were invaded by the Germans. And there would have been more American deaths if the Americans were invaded by the Germans.
How do you feel about those 2 atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan? Is that a glory of the U.S. military machine, or are you ashamed of that? Do you think was it really necessary to drop 2 different kinds of nuclear weapons on civilian populations in Japan? Japan was they were already negotiating to surrender.
They were not.
Yes, they most certainly were.
Well, I just finished 3 volumes written by a guy named Ian Toll. I recommend this to our audience. I recommend you look at Ian Toll's final book of this trilogy, which was The End of the War, and the detail in which he goes into of what was happening with religious theocracy too, zealots in the military of Japan, and how they did not want to give up, and how God was on their side. So I'm not an expert, but read this book. And
okay. Read my blog that I write every year on Hiroshima and Nagasaki Day.
Well, I prefer Ian Toll.
Because I link to primary sources where U.S. officials, U.S. military officials, U.S. governmental officials are discussing, like, okay, the last sticking point is, can they still keep the emperor as the head of, the state? Other than that, they're ready to, they were economically, they couldn't fight anymore. Kamikaze pilots had no landing gear.
We know all about that, but I'm just saying it is untrue to say that the Japanese were willing to give up. That's just not true. So we can move on from
Want
that.
to hear an interesting anecdote about that? I lived in Tokyo for 4 years. My oldest son was born there on December 7th. And I said to my college-educated Japanese neighbors, what a funny coincidence to have a child born in Japan on Pearl Harbor Day. You know what they said? What's Pearl Harbor Day? They had gone to like Tokyo University. And I said, well, you know, that's the day that the Japanese attacked a naval, Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and took out a lot of U.S. Navy vessels. Oh, yeah, I have heard something about that, they'd say. And I said, well, what's the date that you associate with World War II? Which was a stupid question on my part, because duh, Hiroshima Day, which is what they said. And I said to them, why do you think why did that war happen? And they said, oh, the people didn't want the war. The big industrials, the big business cartels wanted the war, and they shoved it down our throats. That sounds really familiar, doesn't it? That's how I feel like we are today.
Well, when you say familiar, does it? I listen to you. I'm interested in your views. I agree with very little of what you say, but I respect you because I think you're smart and I think you are well read and you pay attention to things. So, but I happen, maybe that makes me dumb, but I happen not to agree with very much that you say. Talk about, for a minute, you mentioned Pearl Harbor and your Japanese neighbors and what they thought.
Mm-hmm.
End wars. What do you think? How do you think the United States really should have handled the attack on Pearl Harbor? Not responded?
Well, you know, the United States was working with both the Nazis and the Japanese industrialists. Industrialists, they don't really care what flag they're under, what country they're in. They're in it to make money. So, you know, Ford Motor Company worked with the Nazis. IBM worked with the Nazis. And, you know, the U.S. cut off Japan's...
IBM worked with the Nazis.
Yes, they did. They made the punch cards to keep track of the people of who was going to which concentration camp. And that is a historical fact. But in any case, Japan was very, very dependent on oil imports to keep their industry and economy going. They didn't have any oil. And the U.S. deliberately blocked their oil supply in Southeast Asia. And the U.S. knew that that would bring Japan into the World War that was, you know, starting up in Europe. They knew that. That was
my question was, how do you think the United States should have responded to what happened on December 7th, 1941? Because you say war's no good, end war.
So you're saying, like, ignore all the things that led the Japanese to attack the U.S. Navy in Hawaii.
No, that's part of your answer.
Well, let's start here. Why does the U.S. own Hawaii? Hawaiians have never ceded Hawaii to the United States. That isn't our territory. That belongs to Hawaiians. Why would we have U.S. naval? Hawaii is now covered with military installations, super polluted. The water table is polluted.
You know, the right and the left, the extreme right and the extreme left converge on one thing. They are both overwhelmed with grievances. I ask you a question.
What should the U.S. have done?
Yeah.
And I said, it's the wrong question. What the U.S. should have done is not goad Imperial Japan into a war.
Okay. Now, that's all you're talking about goading, you're saying occurred before December 7th. Now, on December 8th, what should the United States have done?
Probably negotiate. I mean, the only way to not have a war is you got to sit down at the table and you got to negotiate, right?
And give them what...
Well, negotiate. I was a union negotiator. Negotiating doesn't mean give them what they want. It means you come to the table and you tell me what you want, and I come to the table and I tell you what I want, and we start looking for middle ground. Or we find some middle ground. We go, okay, we both want that. Good. Those are, you know, let's initial those. Those are. Yeah. But then we start saying, okay, what do you want most? What would you give up to get that thing that you want most? And I say to you, would you give up this? And you say, no, absolutely, I can't give up that. And you go, okay. Let's try something else. Would you give up that? That is what negotiating is.
Really?
Sure. I worked for American Arbitration Association right out of Bowdoin, and I was trained in, mediation, negotiation kind of stuff. But it wasn't until years later, after I got a master's degree, was teaching, that I realized that I could probably negotiate my own contract better than maybe the math teacher that had been negotiating my contract on my behalf. So I got involved, and I kind of remembered all that negotiation stuff.
I concede you're good at a lot of things, and I've been in a few negotiations myself, so I know what you're talking about. So let's go back to, I want to stick on this war thing. So you think that in a negotiation, the Ukrainians should give up the Donbass region and much of the eastern part of the Ukraine to the Russians?
No, they don't. I don't think they should give up their territory.
You don't?
No, but if they are shelling their own people because they inconveniently are culturally aligned with Russia, speak Russian, are Russian Orthodox, they were threatened by the new regime, the coup regime, didn't want any Russian influence in Ukraine. That is historically impossible. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union and then became
part
its
of the
own.
Soviet Union, yes.
Mm-hmm. So many people in Ukraine have Russian people in their family, or they speak Russian,
and
they speak Ukrainian.
Polish, no question about it.
Sure.
But it is an independent country. You would agree with that?
It is. For the time being, I'd say they are perilously close to losing their independent country at this point.
And how can they avoid that, losing it?
Sit down at the table and negotiate peace, I would say.
And how do you, it's
quickly.
so simple to say.
Well, they don't even have anybody that can do it because Zelensky's term is up, but he's still in office, so he's not even really a legitimate person to. I mean, he was just a comedian that played the piano with his genitals before he became president, so it's not like he was a highly qualified statesman at any point, but he's not even the real president anymore.
Okay. All right.
Did you not know that about Zelensky?
You did not know it, and I'm shocked and
Just
dismayed.
Google it.
And
Google it.
I'm really upset to hear how bad Zelensky is. We haven't even gotten to Israel. How many protests have you've been involved in, anti-Israel protests since the war started?
In 1948?
No.
Well, I wasn't born in 1948.
No. I'm
you mean
sorry.
October 7th?
I better be more
You mean
explicit.
October 7th, 2023?
That is, and I apologize to you for asking such a dumb question.
It's,
But go ahead.
I know you don't think that war started on October 7th, but it's shocking how many people in this country think that war started October 7th. But it's an occupation, it's not a war. Gaza was basically the biggest concentration camp on earth.
Listen, we're going to run out of time.
Are we going to run out of time?
My question is just what you're talking about.
Oh, how many protests?
Yeah, how many protests?
Gosh, I don't keep count.
So let's say a dozen.
Oh, more than a dozen.
Let's say 25.
Probably a dozen in a month, and there have been 12 months, so maybe 140, maybe.
Demonstrations that you've been involved in?
Yeah, I think so, probably.
Jesus,
of one kind or
woman.
another.
But anyway.
Well, I'm retired, so my time is my own.
All right. So now, prior to October 7th, how many anti-Israel demonstrations were you involved in?
Again, I haven't kept count, but some. Again, if you look back at my blog for years, I have,
And there have been protests? Where were the protests prior to October 7th? Where were the protests held?
Where were they held?
Yeah, I mean, where protests, you're in front of some place.
In Portland, in Skowhegan, where I used to live,
Yeah.
and I've been in some in California when I was visiting family there.
When the Trump administration moved the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, as the Netanyahu administration wanted, did you protest?
I don't think I protested that.
Why not? That's a big deal.
because the way that Palestinians have been incarcerated, tortured, their children are incarcerated and tortured, their land is stolen, their ancient olive groves are bulldozed, to me is far more important than like where the capital, people move capitals around.
Well, this was it's all being done to demoralize the Palestinians. It's all these kinds of moves, like the embassy, like the settlements in the West Bank, and all being done to impede the creation of a Palestinian homeland. So it seems to me you like to go back and say what leads to things. I think your failure of your movement to really put the pressure on the United States prior to October 7th, with respect to its dealings with the Netanyahu government, is a cause of the problem. Your failure.
I was busy teaching school for a lot of years. I still went to protest and organized, but I feel like I did my part by teaching. I would teach about the Holocaust, because that was indeed a tragedy in, recent history. And then I would go on from there and teach about the Nakba, which is the violent expulsion of the Palestinian people following after World War II concluded. And that is ongoing today, still going on. I feel like by teaching young people about, it was a course called The Holocaust and Other Genocides. Yeah. Honestly, I always started with the genocide of the indigenous people in Maine.
Do you think the Jews should, at this point now, be expelled from Palestinian, from the land, from what is now Israel?
Expelled?
Expelled. So, sent out to refugee camps.
I think there should be one truly democratic state that is governed by one person, one vote. I think a lot
Hamas doesn't agree with you.
I'm not Hamas. A lot of Israelis are leaving Israel now like rats from a sinking ship. They are, like the airport will just be jammed with people, because a lot of people, and a lot of the settlers in particular, have dual citizenship. They could go, Netanyahu, he's Polish, right?
Look, he's also American. So look, I appreciate you coming down here. You've been very forthcoming. One of the things I like about this show is I don't have to agree with the guest, but that people get to hear the guest and what the guest has to say. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. That was a quick hour, wasn't it? Time flies.
Very, very fast.
Yes.
Very fast.